Welcome to the HiRSE Seminar Series on Research Software Engineering in Helmholtz and beyond.
Okay, then, thanks for the introduction, Claire. And my name is Jessica, and I spend most of my time working on the simulator, focusing on documentation, which is a fairly unique situation, I think, for a lot of research software. And today I want to talk about docs as code, and the reasons for this is that I know that documentation is usually not on the forefront of people's minds, and sometimes it's that they have to do that's not something they want to do. So it can be kind of one of those topics that just people avoid. And the other side of it is that I think we all agree that it's actually a very essential part to software development. It helps us maintain projects for long term, make sure that everything stays recorded. It's also our entry point for users. It's how users discover our software and how they learn what it does and how to use it. And one of the issues, of course, particularly with research software, is a lot of times we don't have a lot of resources. Sometimes we have that one PhD student who is working on the software, but also has to write a thesis and help teach courses and go to conferences and et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes the choice between getting the code done can be and overlooking documentation as something to do later can happen quite often, but a lot of times that doesn't happen, and the quality of documentation can suffer. And so the idea of doing the documentation while you're doing software development is to try to limit this sort of problem from happening. And hopefully making this part of the process also makes it not a pain point and something that maybe is even fun to do for some people. And so with that, I would like to talk about the different types of documentation, which is the user-facing documentation. Maybe I see a bug in it. All that information should be there. Now, of course, the good README is a kind of a basic single-page document. And if you're in a larger project, this becomes insufficient. And so you might need to add more tutorials and more examples and grow and expand on this. But fundamentally, there's lots of good templates out there already to start that. So depending on where you're at with your project, this part of it is kind of the core of it. Now, one thing that I have noticed is that because, again, in research and academia, there was a couple of elements that we always should be considering that sometimes aren't thought of. And that's the sort of elements of peer review publications and citations. So a lot of times our software is involved with some sort of major publications that's essential for providing more context, providing background that maybe people need to know. So obviously having this information is also very important to share if that's something that's already out there. And of course, our citation information is also valuable. If someone's going to use your software in their paper, and it's very important that you get cited, but also the correct version of your software. And sometimes it happens that with NEST, we have people who use the simulator, but don't explain explicitly which version they've used. And this is a problem for reproducibility. It's hard to know if you have any problems with trying to use that paper, if they came from a very old version or a newer version, and what kind of changes have happened. So all this stuff is really important to also share with the community, aside from the kind of standard README information that's available for most projects. On the other, and I'm not going to get into all the details of what other documentation for users there are. There's plenty, and it also depends also on, again, the extent and how big your project is, what other documentation you might have. But on the developer side, a lot of times we think about the code comments, and this is a very important part also to keeping your documentation maintainable, because the code comments allow people to get into the code and see what's happening. And I hope I'm not alone in this thought that I've not come across any developers who've ever said this to me directly, but code comments are very important, and you're as good of a programmer as you might be in writing really elegant scripts that are really well explained. That documentation is really helpful for other people to understand what you're doing in the code. To assume that the person can just read a Python script or whatever other code that you're writing and understand it thoroughly and enough is pretty assumptive, and having some code comments to give people guidance is always very helpful. So it's easy to overlook these, or it's easy to think, oh, I'll remember that later, but future you and future people who might be working on a project will really appreciate if you mention why you put the code in this way, or any sort of important information. I just want to add that this is, although like a lot of times people think about code comments as like kind of that developer documentation, there are other aspects that we should be included, and I wanted to bring them up because the code comments are kind of the details of how your code is developed, but there's also a bigger picture, the design of your project, architecture and things. And I want to bring this up because it's actually come up in our software recently with newer developers, that they come across trying to understand how our code works and finding that some of our documentation is lacking in some areas. And what's lacking is sometimes this overarching linking of larger sections together. And this can be, of course, means that sure they can talk to the senior developers, but getting that sometimes coordinated is time consuming and maybe it doesn't work out. And so having documentation that explains more complexly that your project can be very useful, especially for transferring that knowledge from one generation to the next. And the other type of documentation that's essential, I think, is getting the things done. What kind of workflows are we going to use? What kind of guidelines do we have? This all helps the process to know that wherever the developer group is or whoever's contributing can understand what's expected of them. And when you have those, then we can get to another aspect, and that is we have this documentation, but as is with code, it's not going to be static, right? We have code that needs to be continuously maintained and updated. There's new features that are going to be implemented. There's bugs to be fixed. You're going to be factoring things. There's always something to do. And this also has to be reflected in the documentation. And so for this purpose, we want to try to make sure that every change that we make to the documentation is as easy as possible to maintain and to write. And that's the main goal here. And so with this is why we're going to into docs as code. And I want to use the nest simulator as sort of the example that, because that's the one that I work on and the tools that we use. So just to give you a sort of a context of what nest is, for those who are being unsure, nest is a simulator for spiking neural network models, and it's used by the computational neuroscience community mainly. It's developed in C++, but with a Python-based user interface. So users can write their scripts in Python. And it's scalable, so this means you can use it on your laptop, install it directly in your laptop, but also to the world's largest supercomputers. So depending on the size of your network that you create, you'll need various resources. It's been around for a very, very long time, coming up to 30 years since its inception in 1994, and then got its public release in 2004. And since 2015, it's been available on GitHub as an open source project. And we have an active community with mailing list and active contributors. And a current release schedule is roughly 3 to 4 times a year. And in each release, we have over 20 usually developers who contribute to our code. So it's a fairly large project that's been around for a while. So that means that we also have quite a bit of documentation that we've accumulated. So the documentation in Nest currently stands as a series of installation instructions. So not just one, but for Linux and Mac users, if you want to install from source, use Docker or PPA or other packages. We have multiple guides and tutorials on a number of topics. We have our API that we document. We have over 60 examples, scripts. All of our models, so the neuron and synapse models that we have documentation, and we have over 120 of those. Glossary and a bunch of contributing and style guide documents, as well as, of course, the code comments that we have. So as you can see, it's a lot. And when I started in 2017, they had already started talking about making some changes to how they manage documentation. And we decided that we adopt a lot more of the docs as code um, as the way to move forward and actually get the documentation in a state that the NEST initiative was happy with. So docs as code. So docs as code is a sort of philosophy that you should be writing documentation with the same tools as your code. And this basically means you're using something like, in our case, like GitHub, where we have our documentation in the same repository as the code, so it lives in the same place. We use issue trackers, we have version control, we use plain text markup for the actual content of the documentation. And there were review processes involved with the code and documentation, as well as automated tests. And I'll go through each one of these things in a little more detail. In terms of who or when to use this concept, it can be used in any size project. So if you have a new project and you think this might be a way to go, then it's good to start it at the very beginning. But it can also, as we did, started it already with a project that was already ongoing and implement this sort of philosophy. It's best suited for developer-centric software in the sense that if people are already familiar with these kind of workflows, it's obviously going to work easiest. But as long as people who are contributing are willing to learn a little bit of plain text formatting or version control, these kind of ideas can be adopted as well. And there was a bit of learning curve, but it's not like you need to learn a whole lot of programming. Probably Git would be the biggest learning curve if you're unfamiliar with that. So let's look at each of those items in the docs as code philosophy. Docs in the repo. So this is a very simple one. You assume that your code lives in a repository and you create a separate section for the documentation. It's nearby. And this allows you to see a little bit more clearly, structurally, how the documentation is reflected with your code. So we have various pages that you'll need, like tutorials and guidelines, index pages to create table of contents, all these kinds of things. Yeah, so this is just an idea of how you structure it. The next one is issue trackers. So on GitHub and GitLab and other types of project things like that, you can track your issues for code. So one of the things that we do in Nest is we have issue templates. And one of the templates that we use is one for documentation. So we can, if you have some idea of like how to improve the documentation or you find a problem with it, you can immediately create an issue and explain what the problem is. And so then we know it's directly related to that area. Another thing that we use are labels and tags, as well as projects. So we actually have a project called documentation within the Nest Simulator repository. And that means that we have this board that we can look and see what's there in the to-do for all the pull requests, all the issues that are related to documentation. So as soon as it's labeled with documentation, it comes onto our board and we can see, okay, there's something to do here, or where is it going there? So all of this stuff allows you to keep track. And then you have a nice overview of all the documentation related topics, as well as the other code and issues that you have. The other aspect, of course, is the version control system, like in Git. And the nice thing about this is that it keeps track of everything, right? And then you can know exactly what happened when. If you have any issues, if something breaks along the way, you can always go back and see what's happened. Right? And this is just it's always a great thing to have if you ever need to do that kind of thing. Same with code as well as with documentation. So we just treat the documentation the same way. We create commits for every change that we want to make. And so that you can see the entire review process the same way you would with code. Plain text markup. So this, assuming that you're going to write the content of your documentation with something like Markdown or restructured text. And then the nice thing about this is generally well understood by developers. So even if you want to adopt a more documentation friendly markup like restructured text or ASCII doc, it's usually not that hard to learn how to use the particular markup. And you can use whatever editor that you choose. So if you're a developer who likes to use Vim, you can also edit your documentation in Vim as well, because it's all plain text. So that makes it a lot easier to kind of just do all the editing in the same place. Yeah, so that's one of those benefits there. And then it comes to the review time. So when you have made a change and you want to create a pull request or a merge request, you can create a reviewer system where you can actually select certain reviewers. For something that we do, I will get added as a reviewer to some pull requests, and it's my job to check the documentation aspects of that pull request. And an example for us is if someone wants to create add a new model to Nest, one of the things that we expect them to do is create an example, and it would be my job to take a look at, did they create the example? Does the is there proper links to the example? Does it render out as expected? The style, the structure, is the language also okay? Like, did they write it in a nice plain English that's understandable? So that would be my aspect of the review process. And then there'd be another reviewer who would look mostly at the code, right? Did the model actually do the thing it does? Is the code clean? Is it working as expected? And so what we do is have these guidelines for the reviewers, and part of it is that the documentation should be correct. And if you have some certain types of pull requests, we expect some documentation. So this is sort of in the head of most of our core developer team, that they know that there's certain expectations that documentation is part of a lot of the contributions for code. And then the last part was automated tests. So when the software projects use CI or continuous integration or continuous deployment, and you could also include lots of different tests. We have various tests that we've used or are trying to implement. We're not finished with our implementation yet for Nest, but it comes to documentation. We can do things like check the documentation build, so that if you're using a static site generator or like Sphinx, you can ensure that that gets built successfully. You can check links to make sure that they are all working and they're not even broken. You can even lint prose. So there's things out there like Veil, which will actually lint your text, so like your content. So if you want to do some sort of like spell checking, that kind of thing, that can also be done. You can also check various formats, whether it's a markup language or different things, to make sure that it's all formatted correctly. And if you have anything like any examples that you actually want to run, you can have them tested in an automated test. And again, all of this stuff allows you to just ensure that everything's working as expected. But on the other side, so this everything so far has been how we work, how we use documentation in the same workflow as we would with other software. But there's some other aspects that are kind of not mentioned when we think about it this way, that are more responsibilities in a way for handling documentation, because not only do we have to make sure it works for our developers, we have to ensure that the documentation is accessible for the community. And we always have to consider this perspective anytime we're thinking about how we're going to actually develop the documentation and use it. So when on the one side, we want our documentation for the contributors to be easy to write and easy to maintain, we also want our users to be able to find it, use it, and understand it with as much ease as possible. And this requires a little bit of different thinking as to what are the tools that I need that are going to help me get the documentation to where my user base is, so where they're going to find it, and what are the kind of concepts that in terms of how do I make sure that the content is maximally adjustable by my user base. So for that, there is this another concept, which is maybe less known as Docs as code, but DocOps, which is kind of one that seems to be a newer, but somewhat popular term. And this is similar to DevOps, if you know that one. And this is about automating and integrating the process of developing documentation. So it's more of a set of practices and actions that you would be doing to actually get the documentation out towards the place that you want it to be, or the people that you are directing it to. And for this, there are certain types of responsibilities that you can think of it, or different tasks that kind of have to be put into place. So along with your workflow that you're using, you need to consider what other aspects specifically for documentation that we need to include. So the first thing is selecting and providing support for tools used to produce documentation. So with this, when we talk about, at least with Docs as Code and DocOps, we kind of have these three kind of sections: the markup language, which can be markdown or restructured text. We have to decide on which one makes sense for us. Then there's the static site generator, or the documentation generator. So this is the tool that we're going to use that's going to take that markup language and turn it into HTML. And the ones that we use are Doxygen, which handles C++ very well, and Sphinx, which does a lot with Python. It can do other languages as well, but its main uses for Python documentation. But there's other types of generators out there, and I just gave a couple other examples, like Swagger UI does really well with RESTful APIs. There's things like Docusaurus, Hugo, etc. They do a lot of MDX and React.js. So depending on what kind of output you are seeking and what kind of markup language you're kind of interested in using, you can kind of look to see what kind of generator works well for you. And then the last part is the hosting provider. So read the docs. I'm sure many of you have come across many different types of projects that use Read the Docs as their hosting provider. It's again, it's very linked with Sphinx. So if you have a Python project, that's pretty much guaranteed where people will generally go in use cases. But there's also GitHub pages and other types of hosting providers. But this is where the person is going to find all the documentation. And so once you have these selected, then of course there's a bit of support that you need for these tools and maintenance. And that largely depends kind of on your own time and effort that you're willing to put into it. The next thing, and that also kind of comes into this, is the theme. So it's one of those things that you can either spend a lot of time thinking about or no time at all. The theme what actually people are going to see when they actually go to your website to see your documentation can be something like a built-in theme that is available. Sphinx has tons of themes that you can choose from, and you can customize them if you so choose, or if you're happy with the default values, you can just use those. So the amount of, like I said, for this the tasks here, it depends largely on how much you're willing to spend or want to spend. And because the themes are already pre-existing, you can just take what you have and go with it and then be done and not be too hard about it. The other thing that becomes potentially more work, if you so choose to, is the creation, maintaining, and build scripts. A lot of my experience is with Sphinx. So Sphinx, it's known to be very extensible, and this means that people have created tons of extensions already, and it comes with a lot of extensions that you can use. So if you have, for example, documentation as Python doc streams that you want extracted, there's AutoDoc, which will include documentation from doc streams for you. If you have some mathematical equations that you want to be displayed really nicely using LaTeX, you can have the MathJax extension. If you have Jupyter notebooks that you want to have in your HTML, you have NB Sphinx for that. And there's just tons and tons of extensions that you already created to help make sure that whatever you want to make available for your users can be made available really easily. And most of these extensions that are pre-existing work really well and pretty minimal configuration. So Sphinx has their own built-in. There's third-party extensions as well. But if you're finding that whatever you want is not quite there, at least in terms of Sphinx, you can also do your own thing, and you can customize your own extensions. And so that's something that we've done with Nest. Just to give an example of some of the things that you can do. One of them is extracting documentation from C++. So there are already extensions out there that do extraction from C++ for Sphinx. But what we wanted was a bit of customization with our indexing. So we wanted to have this sort of keyword custom index. And this meant that what was available wasn't really fitting our needs. So we created a Python code that extracts the documentation you wanted and does some little bit of magic with the indexing and gives us out our output of models using these keywords. Another thing that we've done that you can do with Sphinx is integrating Jinja with restructured text. So if you have like data in JSON format that you want to use in your documentation, you can actually add Jinja templating directly to your restructured text files, or a bit of code, Python code to link the two together, and then you can generate your HTML out from that. So the possibilities are pretty extensive. So it's nice that you can kind of customize if you want. But again, like I said, there's a lot of stuff there that you don't necessarily need. The last kind of big responsibility is this to do with content. And this is providing guidance to authors or subject matter experts to allow them to enable contribution to the docs, especially when it comes to research software. A lot of times we have our developers might be experts in the code, but we need experts also in the scientific field to help join those two kind of ideas together, because sometimes they're not always on the same page in terms of the language that they use. And to communicate with the community, sometimes we need to find people to help us make sure to deliver the message correctly. And so all this managing content means that we need, on one hand, things like guidelines and styles and things like that people can follow. But the other part is just talking to people. And this is just especially because documentation is not on the forefront of most people's brain. Getting them to think about it and to help improve it and getting feedback about it is all about talking to your community, whether that's directly with people one-on-one, or maybe with, if you have people on the mailing list, etc. So it's always recommended that as much as it's good to have all the stuff written down and documented, we also need to actually talk to some people. So in general, just to kind of sum up a bit, the advantages for using docs as code is largely because you can use the same workflows you're doing with code. So you don't have to change gears to work on documentation. You don't have to stop what you're doing and like completely use a different system. It's all there with the code development. And so developers can more easily contribute. And then the whole review process can also be regulated within the terms of code development as well, by having somebody responsible for handling some of the documentation aspects. And then you can also use a lot of tools that are out there already. Like there are already lots of things there. You don't have to do a lot of configuration, but if you're so keen on doing it, or you find that maybe things don't quite fit with your needs, you can always customize things as to your need. The downside is one of the things that we've noticed with using workflows is that the documentation kind of has a lot of slowdown in terms of some of the changes. So I can't just click on the website and hit edit to change a typo. It has to be gone through this workflow again of creating a branch, committing something, and making a pull request, right? It's not that long of a process, but it kind of put typos and stuff down on the priority list of things to do. So for those kinds of fast edits, this workflow doesn't work as nicely as with some of the bigger changes. Obviously, if you're going to be building documentation and adding static site generators and doing all these things, you do need to manage them, and they do need time and support. How much time and support can depend on how much you do with it. We spend a lot of time doing different things with it, with our custom scripts and automations. And that also leads to the fact that we actually have to document our documentation. That's something that we also sometimes have to remember, that how we actually do the things that we do need to be clarified for anyone else who wants to contribute. So all of these workflows have to be thought about and documented as well. Now, but I also want to say that just because I've talked about docs as code, I think it's a really good solution. It's worked well with us. It is not the only way to do things. And I do want to point out there are things to think about if you're not sure if this is the way to go for your project. Some things to think about are your budget. So I'm going to take an assumption that most of us have zero budget in terms of spending money on things like documentation. But you may have something. You might be able to get a company who can host your static site generator for you and handle all of that front end stuff for you, right? So that's the possibility of something, and that will kind of change what choices you make on the other end, what kind of markup language you use, or etc. The output that you want. Most people, I assume, want web pages, but maybe PDF is another thing. So does your generator also produce PDFs? Or maybe you have some other thing to think about. And in your institution or wherever you're working, there might already be some sort of integrated system or tool. Maybe there's some sort of ticketing system that's already in place that you want to link with the documentation, or a content management system that's used. And you want to stay within that realm. So that might also change what options you have or what tools you can use. The programming skills of your contributors. So depending on the type of software that you have and what people will need to be doing with it, you might want to think about, are they going to be general knowledge, people who have no experience? How much programming do you need to do or expect them to do when it comes to the development process? And things like editing your HTML. Again, this is like, do you really want to spend time customizing things? What about text editors versus your WYSIWYG? So programs like MS Word or Google Docs. If most of your team really like to use Microsoft Word to write things in, it'd be a lot harder to use something like convince them for a text editor maybe. But those are things that you have to consider. And also your integration of subject matter experts. Who are they? Well, relative to your developer team, are they the same people or are they different? And how do you want to get them involved in that process? Is they directly contributing, creating pull requests, or are they just there as people to ask questions and someone else does the actual work of adding it to your documentation? How do you manage your contributors and reviewers? Who is in charge of that? And what is your kind of range of people that you're trying to grow your community and trying to get like a much more open invitation to allow everybody to contribute? Do you want to focus in on a very specific tasks? And of course, the continuous integration deployment and how that is all going to work in your project. Lots of projects, of course, deployed in various places. We have maybe not just your website, but you have other things like there's eBrains as one, where you have a version of software that you need to make available. And all these things have to be considered too as part of the workflow. Yeah, so things to think about when it comes to your development workflow. And I want to end just by saying that if you do have questions, you can obviously ask me at the end here, but in general, if you're looking at how do I do something with documentation, I strongly suggest that you take a look at Rate the Docs. It's a community of people who care about documentation, and it has tons of information available on their website. They have a Slack channel with over 20,000 members. So if you want to find a channel on AI or analytics or style guides or docs as code, they're all there, and you can see what people are talking about. They also do conferences, and all their videos are recorded and made available. So if anything about documentation that you want to find out more, it's a great resource to have. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for watching our seminar. Please check out the slides on Zenodo linked below and see you next time.